people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
News.
Okay, we'll start with this. The controversy at the Olympics continues as Emain Khalif's trainer confirms a quote-unquote problem with chromosomes as Spanish national boxing team commissioner reveals that Khalif was considered too dangerous to train against women. Shocking news out of the Olympic boxing controversy as the technical commissioner of the Spanish boxing team reveals that Algerian boxer Emain Khalif was reportedly considered too dangerous for women to train against during a boxing retreat in Spain. Speaking to Radio Marca, former Olympic boxer and Olympic boxing trainer Rafa Lozano revealed that he thought the inclusion of Khalif in the women's category was unjust and dangerous to females. I don't see it as fair. Everyone can think what they want, but that's how I see it, Lozano said, recalling his observations of the Algerian during a retreat at the sports center CAR Bloom in Madrid. They were doing a retreat at Bloom, and we couldn't put her with anyone. We put Khalif with Jennifer Fernandez, and it hurt her.
One can make the argument that in a contact sport like boxing that's dangerous enough as it is, well, you're bound to get hurt when you're getting punched in the face. However, the probability of serious and permanent injury is increased if you're allowing an XY fighter, a fighter with XY chromosomes, to fight a fighter with XX chromosomes. They were doing a retreat at Bloom, and we couldn't put her being Emain Khalif, with anyone. We put Khalif with Jennifer Fernandez, and it hurt her. Whoever we put Khalif with was injured. Lozano says that to avoid further injury to the women, the coaches ended up pairing Khalif with Jose Quiles, who is one of Spain's top male boxers. During the retreat, Quiles, 26, and one of Spain's top boxers, was considered a more equitable match for Khalif to spar against, with Lozano noting that Khalif was only quote-unquote even after being matched against the man. Lozano continued that he believed that allowing Lin Yuting and Emain Khalif to compete in the female category was not appropriate. From my point of view, I don't see it as fair, but Lozano is not the only sport expert who weighed in on Khalif's ineligibility to compete against women, with another being Khalif's own trainer. In an exclusive interview with Le Point magazine, Khalif's coach confirmed that the Algerian has a male karyotype and high testosterone. A glaring difference between Emain Khalif and the other fighters in the category. The center of the controversy is a question. If the uniqueness of this fighter's biology constitutes a competitive edge over the other fighters in the category, then should they even be allowed to compete among them? Some have made the argument that the edge Khalif has over the other fighters in their category is no different than the edge Michael Phelps had over the other swimmers in his category. The logical fallacy with that argument is Michael was swimming against other swimmers of the same karyotype, whereas Emain is fighting against fighters that are not of the same karyotype. This may finally confirm the speculation by sports scientists who have roundly claimed that Khalif is a genetic male with a disorder of sexual development, DSD. Following the initial Redux report which broke the news that Khalif and another previously disqualified athlete, Lin Yuting, had been included in the women's boxing at this year's Olympics, a media storm has surrounded the two boxers. Both obtained gold in their respective categories this past week. Over the last 2 weeks, the IBA, which had been responsible for Khalif and Lin's 2023 disqualifications, has stood firm in support of their previous decision. The IBA has released evidence, statements, and even held a press conference to explain the reasoning for the boxers' disqualification and had released details of the 2023 correspondence between the IBA, the boxers, and the IOC. And all the while, there has been pushback those who were discrediting the IBA and questioning the legitimacy of their findings.
During the August 5th press conference, IBA officials discussed the reasoning for the boxers being disqualified and informed the audience that both boxers had not appealed the decision to the Court of Arbitration in Sport despite facing no financial burden to do so.
What does that mean?
That the fighters didn't try to appeal the IBA's decision because they knew that they couldn't. They knew that based on how the IBA defines who's qualified to compete in a category, they didn't meet those qualifications, so they didn't fight their ruling. They knew they couldn't win. The IBA also detailed their attempts to warn the IOC of the dangers of including the boxers in the female competition in an email which the IOC replied to and then allegedly ignored until the recent media storm. It was also clarified by the IBA that the boxers were found to be ineligible due to their chromosomes and that they were being prevented from releasing the results of the tests by the boxers' respective national committees of Algeria and Taiwan.
They lawyered up.
But the IBA told those in attendance, quote unquote, read between the lines, indicating that the boxers do not have XX chromosomes and to come to their own logical conclusions because they were not at liberty to divulge.
The results of those tests were being suppressed by the fighters and their lawyers.
Clarification was also given by Dr. Ioannis Philapatos, the former chair of IBA Medical Committee, who spoke at the conference and confirmed that the blood and medical tests found the boxers were male. It is reported that during the conference, BBC journalists walked out in protest.
Yeah, because they don't want the truth. They want it to be a feel-good story, a fairy tale.
In an IOC press conference in response to the scandal, Thomas Bach articulated that the IOC only used the legal sex of an athlete, such as that documented on their passport, to determine their eligibility to compete in the women's category.
Though if it were really that simple, we wouldn't be here now and there wouldn't be any controversy to talk about.
Speaking at a Sex Matters press briefing on the topic of the inclusion of males in women's sports and the Olympic boxing eligibility controversy, Dr. Emma Hilton, a developmental biologist, explained, allowing a male into the female boxing ring is kind of the equivalent of letting a heavyweight into the ring with a lightweight.
This is a biologist saying this.
It's not Ring IQ, the content creator, or some concerned boxing fan online. This is a biologist.
An expert.
So where a biologist is saying that there are noticeable differences, and those differences constitute an unfair advantage, the IOC is telling you that there's no difference at all. And they are whatever their passport says they are, even if their passports can be augmented, can be changed. Biologist Dr. Hilton continued by stating that people underestimate the chasm of difference between male and female strength, adding, a female has to be well over 30 kilograms heavier than a male to match strength levels. Further evidence of Khalif's disproportionate strength compared to female boxers was illustrated in an interview with Mexican boxer Brianna Tamara Cruz, who boxed Khalif at the Golden Belt Series finals in Guadalajara back in 2022, the year before Khalif was disqualified. Speaking to El Español, Cruz described the fight as extraordinary. When I fought Khalif, I felt it was very much out of my reach. I was hurt a lot by the punches. I think I had never in my 13 years as a boxer felt like this, not even in my sparring with men. Cruz went on to tell the outlet that she felt she narrowly escaped a potentially fatal situation, and the disqualification came in time to prevent such a scenario from occurring. Thank God that day I came out of the ring well, and it's good that they finally realized.
So the takeaway here is that the IBA wasn't lying.
And at the center of it all is a fundamental question. If this fighter's unique biology gives them a competitive edge over the other fighters in the category, then should they even be allowed to compete? The IOC allowed it.
There are a lot of people coming forward saying that they shouldn't have.
Men's junior middleweight news. Official word from the WBO came down yesterday. Samson Lukowicz is ready to negotiate a fight between Sebastian Fundora and Terence Crawford, according to a WBO mandate. Promoter Samson Lukowicz is set to begin negotiations facing his protege, Sebastian Fundora, with interim WBO and full WBA champion Terence Crawford. This showdown, ordered by the World Boxing Organization, seeks to define who is the true champion of the junior middleweight division. However, negotiations discussions are on pause, awaiting a formal request from Crawford's team to officiate the fight, according to exclusive statements obtained by Boxing Urbano Network. Francisco Vergil, Paco Vergil, WBO president, confirmed that Crawford's team has officially notified his stay at junior middleweight, which has left the organization's welterweight title vacant. That went to Brian Norman. So far, no formal letter has been received from Crawford's team demanding the fight against Fundora, despite the interim champion having acquired the right to do so. What's interesting here is that Samson Lukowicz, who promotes Sebastian Fundora, has said he's ready to negotiate the fight between Sebastian and Terrence, where Sebastian this past weekend said,
People saying the fight that makes sense, money is Fundora Spence. But now Spence is no longer, correct? Is that fight completely off?
That is not true. That is not true.
People, who is reporting these things?
You know, you go on social media, you're going to see a lot of lies.
Okay.
If you want the right things, I'm not going to tell you guys everything because it's not my job. That's a promoter job.
It's still in the works, possibly.
Of course, it's still in the works. Of course. Spence is Spence. You know, I don't see why he would retire, but you see these rumors online and.
So Samson is saying they're ready to negotiate a Crawford fight, where Sebastian is saying they're negotiating a Spence fight. That's what's in the works. By now, it's not uncommon to see that Samson says one thing and his fighters tend to say another. Like when he said to YSM Sports Media that they signed a contract to fight David Morrell, that David Benavidez has signed a contract to fight David Morrell, just for David Benavidez to call that fake news.
It's not uncommon for Samson to say one thing and for his fighter to say another.
The only silver lining I see, the only saving grace, is that Crawford has yet to formally request the bout with Sebastian Fundora. Though once he does, Sebastian's on the hook, and he will be forced to oblige him or vacate the brown belt, vacate the WBO title, and I expect that might happen.
Few passing thoughts.
Right before this news broke, there was a sharp focus on a Crawford versus Vergil Ortiz fight. Vergil Ortiz, who was in action this past weekend. Vergil Ortiz, who Turki Al-Sheikh himself said he wants to put him in the ring with Terrence. That if he takes care of business on Saturday, he'll see if he can make a Crawford fight afterwards.
Said this during the live broadcast alongside Vergil's promoter, Oscar De La Hoya.
Just for Vergil himself to call out the winner of Sebastian Fundora versus Errol Spence Jr. post-fight. Vergil said that's who he wants to fight next. He didn't mention Terrence.
Wow.
Post-fight, I also happened to catch some comments from Bernard Hopkins of Golden Boy Promotions, who recommended they put Vergil Ortiz in the ring with Charles Conwell.
What?
Bernard said, absolutely, it's in-house, so it's not like you have to go through hurdles to get there. That's the plus side of it, the side that people want to see, whether it's the fans, whether it's the networks, all that plays a role. But we have both fighters with us. I wouldn't mind seeing that fight. When it happens, it could be this year, I'm hoping, because we want to make the best fights.
Nothing against Charles Conwell, but he hasn't established himself as the best at anything at 154 pounds. Terrence Crawford has been there for all of one fight, and he's a champion. He's a champion already, among the best of the best fighters at the weight. So shouldn't you be looking at him?
They don't want to, and they've never wanted to. Whether you're talking about way back there in 2022, 2 years ago, or 2 years later here and now, Golden Boy and Vergil have never wanted the Crawford fight because the opportunity was there. In September of 2022, Vergil was ranked number 1 with the WBO. And in September of 2022, what was he doing? Petitioning the WBA. Petitioning the WBA for an Amantis Stanionis fight, for a Reggie belt.
Why would you want to fight for a regular title instead of a full title? Why are you petitioning the WBA instead of the WBO? Paco Vergil, president of the WBO, stated quite plainly that a Crawford fight was afforded to Ortiz 2 times, and he rejected the fight both times. I have no doubts that's what he's talking about.
Could have got a title shot via the WBO. You chose to go in another direction, the direction of the WBA. You didn't want that fight then. You don't want that fight now.
That's why you didn't call out Crawford after the fight. You called out the winner of Spence versus Fundora that isn't even on the schedule yet.
Bernard is making the recommendation that you should fight Charles Conwell. You should fight Charles Conwell next.
Why?
I suppose that everybody over there is now breathing a sigh of relief that that Sebastian Fundora is on the hook, that he may have to fight Terence Crawford in defense of his WBO title, or the title is forfeit. I suppose Vergil and all of his fans are now breathing a sigh of relief.
I'm not letting it go.
These supposed boxing fans and content creators that think they're doing God's work by pointing out everybody else's biases as if they don't have biases of their own.
Clear as day.
I even saw some making the recommendation that instead of fighting Vergil Ortiz, Terence should fight Jaron Boots Ennis. Jaron Ennis, who's still at 147. Jaron Ennis, who Eddie Hearn said isn't gonna move up until he unifies that division first. That Jaron Ennis?
You guys sound like the Spence fans. Isn't that what the Spence fans were doing over a year ago? Hiding behind Jaron Ennis and trying to use him as a shield to protect Errol. Now the Ortiz fans are basically doing the same thing. Because you're just as scared as the Spence fans were.
And just as biased. So the idea that any one of them would point the finger at anyone else over what are their biases is pure comedy, because you're both playing the same game.
It's the same thing.
You think your shit don't stink, and you expect anybody to take you serious?
Critical thinkers don't.
And so Vergil Ortiz and his nervous fans can breathe a sigh of relief that the WBO is in many ways putting Sebastian Fundora on the spot. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the fight between him and Terence will happen,
But it does mean that something has to.
Sebastian Fundora would present a very awkward challenge for Terence Crawford because of his frame, his statuesque frame, his physical dimensions. That Sebastian presents an awkward challenge to anyone and everyone at these weights because it's not customary for a fighter to be that tall or that long at 154.
And tack on that he's a southpaw.
I suppose that the saving grace for Terence is that Tim Kazoo, who doesn't have the same reach, the same wingspan as Terence, his arms are actually a bit shorter, through his timing and his strength, for at least the first 2 rounds of his fight with Sebastian, he was able to time him and nail him.
It wasn't until that cut opened up on the top of his head, blood seeped into his eye, hampering his vision, that things went sideways. But while he could see,
He was piling on the damage, piling up damage very quickly, just 2 rounds into the fight. So if he can time Sebastian Fundora, then Terence can time Sebastian Fundora, especially now that he's had a fight.
he'll be sharper the next time you see him because he won't have any ring rust to shake off.
The real question is, does Samson Lukowicz actually mean business? Are they going to go through with the Crawford fight, or is it the way Sebastian says it is, and they're negotiating a Spence fight? Errol Spence Jr., who has yet to hire a new trainer, a new corner, since he parted ways with his longtime trainer, Derek James.
After all these weeks and months, no news has broken as to who's supposed to be training him moving forward. Who's supposed to be training him to fight Sebastian?
And is that even a good idea? Off over a year of inactivity, a crushing defeat at a new weight against a very awkward fighter, it's a recipe for disaster.
Errol's gonna do this?
There are mixed signals, and there are always mixed signals when Samson Lukowicz and his fighters are involved. Because Samson's telling you they're ready to negotiate with Crawford, but his fighter's telling you they're negotiating with Spence.
So which one is it?
I'm not completely convinced that Sebastian will go through with this. He may end up vacating the WBO title, forfeiting the title to Terence, who may end up fighting someone else. Who specifically, I don't know.
So if Team Fundora have to choose, they're gonna choose Errol for obvious reasons, because now's a very good time to fight Errol Spence.
Under these circumstances, a very fluid situation at 154. 4.